Okay, we're on page 105 for the solution to the case of Merkel's grandson. Both the tall woman and Fred Gibson spoke the truth. Although the great Merkel was not his grandfather, Fred Gibson was the great Merkel's grandson. The great Merkel, as the Encyclopedia realized, was a woman. She was Fred Gibson's grandmother. How did he figure that one out? Oh, he's smarter than Grandma. Okay, let's turn back now to page 43, and I'll read the case of the bank robber. $3.50, exclaimed the Encyclopedia as he finished counting the money in the treasury of the Brown Detective Agency. Business is booming. You should put that money in a bank, said Sally Kimball, whom Encyclopedia had made his bodyguard and junior partner. Money isn't safe in a shoebox. Maybe you're right, said Encyclopedia. Sometimes even shoes aren't safe in a shoebox. It would look awful if a detective agency was robbed. The partners talked it over. They decided to take the money downtown to a bank and start a savings account. It was too far to ride on their bicycles, so they took the bus. They got off near the Corning National Bank on Beach Street. As they stepped out of the bus, they heard the sound of shooting. At first, Encyclopedia thought the bus had backfired. A moment later, he saw a man in the doorway of the bank. The man wore a hat. A handkerchief covered the lower part of his face. In one hand, he held a yellow paper bag. With the other, he waved a gun. Somebody shouted, "Hold up! Hold up!" Then all at once, everybody was running, trying to get out of the robber's way. The man with the gun turned and fled. In his haste, he did not seem to look where he was going. He ran into a beggar wearing dark glasses and carrying a white cane and tin cup. The beggar's cane and cup flew into the street. The robber and the beggar fell to the sidewalk. They rolled about together for a few seconds before the robber broke away and got to his feet. He raced down the street just as a police car drew up before the bank. Chief Brown and one of his officers leaped out of the car and ran after the robber. "We caught him," said Chief Brown at dinner that night. "He led us a merry chase, but we got him. The trouble is, we can't charge him with the robbery." "But why not?" Mrs. Brown demanded. "Yes, Dad, why not?" Encyclopedia asked. "Wasn't the money he stole in the yellow paper bag he was carrying?" Chief Brown laid down his fork. "Do you know what we found in that yellow bag of his?" "Money?" "No, a loaf of white bread. He resisted police officers, but I don't know how long we can keep him in jail." "Are you sure you caught the right man, Dad?" Encyclopedia said. "We'll have a hard time proving it," said Chief Brown. "No one can identify him, and nobody saw the robber's face. He wore a handkerchief over his nose and mouth, and his hat was pulled down over his forehead and eyes. This man we picked up is wearing a brown suit, and the teller at the bank says the robber wore a suit the same color. And of course there is the yellow bag. But where's the money?" "Does the man you picked up have any distinguishing features?" Encyclopedia wanted to know. "Well, he has a pug nose and a scar running down one cheek. But remember, no one saw the robber's face," said Chief Brown. "I can hold him in jail overnight for resisting a police officer. That's about all." "I never saw a beggar in Idaville before today," said Encyclopedia thoughtfully. "Oh, the blind man," said Chief Brown. "He seems like a nice old fellow. He calls himself Blind Tom. I hated to tell him it's against the law to beg here." "The poor man," said Mrs. Brown. "Won't the Salvation Army help him?" "Yes," replied Chief Brown. but he said he likes being on his own. He promised to leave town tomorrow. Where is he staying? Said Encyclopedia. At the old Martin Inn, answered Chief Brown. One of those buildings in the road down by the railroad tracks. Why do you ask? Have you got an idea about this case, Leroy? No, mumbled Encyclopedia. Mrs. Brown looked hurt. She had come to expect her son to solve the case before dessert. After dinner, Encyclopedia walked over to Sally's house. I have to work this evening, he said. I may need you. Want to come? Oh, boy, do I, Sally sang out. The sky was growing dark as the two detectives rode their bicycles down a dingy block west of the railroad station. Who lives here? Asked Sally, as Encyclopedia stopped in front of a rundown hotel. Blind Tom the Beggar. He'll be leaving town tomorrow. That's why we have to see him this evening. Do you think he can help us? Asked Sally. I think so. A blind man sees with his hands, replied Encyclopedia. Remember how the beggar rolled with the robber on the sidewalk? If he felt the robber's face through the handkerchief, he might know him again. I get it, said Sally. If he could feel the man's face again, he might know whether the man your father caught is really the robber. Right, answered Encyclopedia. Gosh, said Sally, I hope he hasn't left town yet. Inside the hotel, the desk clerk gave the two young detectives some help. Blind Tom lived alone. His room was number 214. Sally and Encyclopedia climbed the dark, creaky stairs to the second floor. They knocked on the door number 214. Nobody answered. Look, the door's not shut, whispered Sally. Shall I? Encyclopedia nodded. Sally pushed the door till it swung open so that they could look into the room. The room was small and shabby. Against the far wall stood an iron bed. A small reading lamp cast its light upon a copy of the Idaville Daily News that lay open on the pillow. Suddenly the tapping of a cane sounded in the hall. Tap, tap, tap. Blind Tom came up behind Sally. Is someone here? He asked. I haven't had a visitor in a long time. I wasn't expecting anyone tonight, but it's nice to have. You. He lifted his cane. Won't you come in? No, thanks, said Encyclopedia. He pushed Sally down the hall and hurried her down the stairs. She didn't have a chance to catch her breath until they were outside the hotel. Why the big rush? Sally asked. I thought you were going to ask Blind Tom if he could recognize the man who robbed the bank this afternoon. I don't have to ask him, replied Encyclopedia. Blind Tom knows the robber because Blind Tom helped in the robbery. How did Encyclopedia know? Okay, shut off the TV, and then when you've thought about it for a while, turn to page 106, and we'll read the solution to the case of the bank robber. Page 106, Solution to the case of the bank robber. Blind Tom was not expecting any visitors, he said. He also said that he had not had any visitors in a long time. Yet the light in his room was on, and a newspaper lay on the pillow. A blind man does not need a light, and he cannot read a newspaper. So Blind Tom was not blind at all. Encyclopedia knew then why the beggar had not stepped out of the way of the bank robber. The two men had rolled on the sidewalk together with a purpose, to exchange yellow paper bags. Blind Tom had slipped the robber the bag holding the loaf of bread in order to fool the police if they caught him. The robber had slipped Blind Tom the bag holding the money. Encyclopedia used a telephone in the store on the corner to call his father. Chief Brown hurried to the hotel. He found the money, still in the yellow paper bag, hidden under the mattress of Blind Tom's bed. Blind Tom and the man the police were holding in jail confessed that they had robbed the bank. Pretty clever. Okay, turn back then to the page 51, the case of the happy nephew. We begin reading on page 53. The Browns were having leftover meatloaf for dinner one night when the telephone rang. "It must be important," said Mrs. Brown worriedly. "Otherwise, why would anyone call during the dinner hour?" She hurried to the telephone. In a moment she called to her husband. "It's Officer Carlson, dear." Chief Brown went to the telephone and spoke with his officer for several minutes. Then he returned to the dining room. Well, when he returned to the dining room, he wore a frown and his gun. "The Princess Bake Shop on Vine Street was robbed less than an hour ago," he said. "I'll have to go out." "Any clues, Dad?" asked Encyclopedia. "We have an eyewitness," answered his father. "A man passing the bakery says he saw John Abbott running out the door." "Hasn't John Abbott been in prison?" asked Mrs. Brown. "5 years ago," said Chief Brown, "but he's gone straight ever since he came out." The eyewitness only got a quick look at the robber. He might be mistaken. Chief Brown shrugged. "Still, I suppose I'll have to stop by and question John. I hope he has a good alibi." "Can I go with you?" cried Encyclopedia. "May I go with you?" his mother said. "And drink your milk first." "May I go with you, Dad?" Encyclopedia asked. He gulped his milk. "Come along if you like," said his father, "but you will have to stay in the car and be quiet." "I'll be as quiet as a cat at a dog show," promised Encyclopedia. He sat quietly beside his father in the police car on the drive to the house where John Adam lived with his sister and her family. "Staying in the car won't be so bad," Encyclopedia decided. "The car will be a lot closer to the case than our dining room." On the west side of town, his father stopped the car. "Here's the house." Encyclopedia saw a small white house in need of paint. An old yellow car stood in the shaded driveway. "There's John," said Chief Brown. A tall young man had come out of the house. He was carrying a barefoot boy about a year and a half old. Chief Brown reminded Encyclopedia to sit quietly in the car. Then he got out and walked toward John Abbott. "Put the child down, John," Chief Brown called, "and keep your hands where I can see them." John Abbott started to lower the barefoot baby onto the sharp stones of the gravel driveway. Then he changed his mind and put the child on the front fender of the yellow car and raised his hands. "What's this all about, Chief?" he asked. "Robbery," replied Chief Brown. "You were seen running out of the Princess Bake Shop on Vine Street an hour ago. The door was broken and all the money in the cash register was stolen." John Abbott laughed. "I wasn't near Vine Street an hour ago. Why, all day—" "Look out!" shouted Chief Brown. He leaped for the baby. The child had climbed onto the hood of the yellow car. He smiled and gurgled happily. Suddenly he stood up and walked close to the edge of the hood. Chief Brown caught him just as he started to fall off the car. "Thanks, Chief," said John Abbott. "He's my nephew. I'll hold him." "No, I'll hold him," said Chief Brown. "Just tell me where you were today." "Anyone who says he saw me coming out of the Princess Bake Shop an hour ago is either crazy or a liar," said John Abbott. "Can you prove you were somewhere else?" "I was miles away," said John Abbott. "Since 8 o'clock this morning I've been driving this car. I drove down from Sundale Shores. I got here just 5 minutes before you came." Chief Brown looked at his watch. "You drove 600 miles in less than 12 hours, he said. "Did you stop around 6 o'clock and talk to anyone?" Somebody we can check your story with?" "No, not around 6 o'clock, said John Abbott. "I stopped for gas and a hamburger about 4:30. Then I drove straight through. I didn't break any speed limit, and I had nothing to do with any bake shop robbery." "I'd like to think you are telling the truth," said Chief Brown. "I am. I've gone straight, believe me," said John Abbott. "All right," said Chief Brown. "I'll have to question the eyewitness who says he saw you. Maybe it will turn out that he wasn't sure." Chief Brown put the baby in John Abbott's arms and walked back to the police car. I heard and saw everything, Dad, said Encyclopedia. How come you didn't arrest him? Because he says he was driving from Sundale Shores when the robbery took place, answered Chief Brown. He got here just 5 minutes before we came. I can't prove he is lying. At least not yet. He slipped into the seat beside Encyclopedia and started the car. Listen to me, Leroy, he said. Our eyewitness may have made a mistake. He may have seen a man who only looked like John Abbott. A good police officer doesn't put people in jail without more proof than that. I believe the witness, said Encyclopedia. John Abbott didn't just drive in from Sundale Shores in that old yellow car. I can prove he didn't. What was the proof? Okay, you think about it, then shut off the tape recorder, and turn to page 107. Did you think of the way that Encyclopedia knew? Okay, on page 107 is the solution to the case of the Happy Nephew. John Abbott said he had reached his sister's house only 5 minutes before Chief Brown arrived. If John had just driven in from Sundale Shores, the motor and the hood of the car would still have been burning hot. Remember, he had made only one stop for a hamburger and gas during the 12-hour trip. If that was true, his little nephew, who was barefoot, would have cried out in pain when he stood on the hot hood of the car. Instead, the baby smiled and gurgled happily. Therefore, the hood was not hot. A cool hood meant that the car had not just been parked after a 12-hour drive, as John Abbott said. Pretty clever. Okay, Nathan, I think we've got room on the tape for just one more story, and that will be the case of the diamond necklace on page 63. Ready? You've hardly touched your soup, said Mrs. Brown. Something is wrong. I am not hungry, said Chief Brown. He pushed his chair back from the dining table. It's that Van Tweedle case, said Mrs. Brown. Now stop blaming yourself. What happened, Dad? Asked Encyclopedia. I wish I knew, answered his father. Last night I was at Mrs. Van Tweedle's yearly party for the community chest drive. I was guarding a diamond necklace. He drew a deep breath. The necklace was stolen right under my nose. Mrs. Van Tweedle must have been afraid it might be stolen, said Encyclopedia. Was that why she asked you to guard it? Chief Brown nodded. She received an unsigned letter last week. It told her to put $10,000 in cash behind the statue of George Washington in the park. If she refused to do this, her necklace would be stolen. Wow, exclaimed Encyclopedia. Is the necklace really worth $10,000? More, said his father. Want the facts? Encyclopedia closed his eyes and prepared for some hard thinking. Go ahead, Dad. Mrs. Van Tweedle planned to give the necklace away during the party, Chief Brown began. That is, she was going to sell it to the highest bidder on the stroke of midnight. The money was to go to the community chest. To show off the necklace, Mrs. Van Tweedle's old college roommate, Miss Stark, wore it at the party. At first, I didn't let Miss Stark out of my sight. Around 11 o'clock, Miss Stark said she felt ill. She went upstairs to the guest room. She said she wanted to rest a little while. I went into the room ahead of her. I wanted to make sure no one was there. Then I had her lock the door, and I stood guard in the hall. 10 minutes passed. Suddenly, I heard her scream. A few seconds later, 2 shots rang out. I called to Miss Stark. She didn't answer. I broke down the locked door. Miss Stark was lying on the bed in a faint. The necklace was gone from her neck. When she came to, she could tell me little. Everything had happened so quickly. She had heard nothing, and she fainted before she could see the thief, she said. The thief must have got in and out by the window. 2 bullets were in the wall above the bed. Miss Stark was lucky that she wasn't killed. Encyclopedia's father finished speaking. A silence fell over the Browns' dining room. Then Encyclopedia asked one question. Was Miss Stark left alone in the room after you broke in? Chief Brown looked surprised at this question. He thought a bit before answering. Let me see. I was with her all the time. Mrs. Van Tweedle came up to the room as soon as she heard the racket. Then the doctor came. He took Miss Stark directly to the hospital. He never left her side. The hospital? Said Mrs. Brown. The poor girl, she must have had a terrible scare. She was pretty badly shaken, said Chief Brown. The doctor ordered complete rest and quiet. She has to stay in the hospital until tomorrow. Good, said Encyclopedia, opening his eyes. But there is no time to lose. Her room must be searched before she gets back. Searched for what? Asked Chief Brown. For the necklace, said Encyclopedia, and the gun. Leroy, exclaimed Mrs. Brown, do you think the thief would be so silly as to leave the necklace and the gun behind? She did, said Encyclopedia calmly. She had no choice. She? Gasped Chief Brown. Do you mean Miss Stark? What makes you think she did it? It's quite simple, said Encyclopedia. First, she tried to get $10,000 out of her old classmate by writing that letter. But the letter didn't work, Chief Brown said. Mrs. Van Tweedle hired me to guard the necklace. The letter only made it tougher for Miss Stark. She didn't think it would, Encyclopedia pointed out. She must have talked Mrs. Van Tweedle into letting her wear the necklace at the party. The whole idea sounds pretty weak to me, said Chief Brown. Think how fast Miss Stark would have had to work. She would have had to hide the necklace and the gun after she fired the 2 shots into the wall. She must have known I'd break down the door the instant I heard the gun go off in the room. She hid the necklace before she fired the shots, said Encyclopedia. Well, if you are right, the gun and the necklace are still in the room, said Chief Brown. I'll telephone one of my men to search it right away. An hour later, Officer Murphy called back. Mrs. Van Tweedle's guest room had been searched. The necklace and the gun had been found, hidden in a hat box on a closet shelf. The Browns had finished dinner. Encyclopedia was in the kitchen drying dishes for his mother when he heard the news. Miss Stark expects to leave the hospital tomorrow, a rich woman, said Encyclopedia. All she had to do, she thought, was to go back to the room and pick up the hat box with the gun and the necklace, said Chief Brown. She might have got away with it, said Encyclopedia, but every crook makes one mistake. What was Miss Stark's mistake? Think about it, shut off the recorder, and then look on page 108. Okay? Page 108. Solution to the case of the diamond necklace. Miss Stark said that she did not see or hear the thief, yet Chief Brown heard her scream, and a few seconds later, 2 shots rang out. Miss Stark's mistake was screaming before the shots were fired. If she had not seen or heard anyone, she would have had no reason to be frightened. Only after the shots had been fired would she have screamed. Boy, that's pretty good detective work. I don't know whether I would have been smart enough or not. Okay, I'm not sure we've got enough room on the tape for one more story. Anyway, it's on page 73. Maybe we can read part of it at least. Okay, page 73. This is the case of the knife in the watermelon. Mr. Patch was the first grown-up to come to the Brown Detective Agency. He was carrying a watermelon. Mr. Patch owned a grocery store. He showed the watermelon to Encyclopedia. It had a knife buried in it up to the handle. Find the boy who owns this knife, wrote Mr. Patch. Look what he did. Encyclopedia looked at the watermelon. Stabbing a watermelon isn't against the law, he pointed out. I mean, it's not the same as stabbing a person. The knife ended in my watermelon. Mr. Pat shouted. "It started in the window of my storeroom." "Someone used the knife to break into your storeroom and to open my money box," cried Mr. Patch. "How much was stolen?" asked Encyclopedia. "The thief didn't have time to take anything," said Mr. Patch in a calmer voice. "He heard me coming and he got scared. When he started to run, he tripped and fell. His knife plunged into this watermelon and he didn't have time to pull it out." "Did you see his face?" Mr. Patch shook his head. "No, but I did see he had the letter L on the back of his jacket. That means he's a lion, a member of the Boys Club on Woodburn Avenue," said Encyclopedia. "A real read." The private detective stepped closer to the watermelon. The knife had plunged into it so deeply that only the carved wood handle showed above the green skin. Mr. Patch laid a quarter on the gasoline can. "Find the owner of this knife, quick." "I'm sorry," replied Encyclopedia, thinking he would have to charge for expenses on this case. "I'll need a little time. I have to buy a fingerprint kit. Then I have to dust the handle of the knife and—" "There are no fingerprints," said Mr. Patch heavily. "I wiped them off." You wiped them off?" asked Encyclopedia weakly. Mr. Patch explained. "My cat knocked a bag of flour off a shelf. It broke and spilled over the watermelon and knife. I wiped off the flour and the fingerprints, too." Encyclopedia clasped his head and moaned. Then he looked up. "Still, the thief doesn't know that you wiped off his fingerprints." Encyclopedia took out his handkerchief. He wrapped it carefully around the handle of the knife. "That does it," he said. "That makes it look as though we have fingerprints we are trying to save. The thief may try to wipe them off and get himself away. We'll have to watch all the lions. Let's go." Encyclopedia got into Mr. Patch's truck. They drove over to Woodburn Avenue. 4 lions, John, Frank, Cody, and Buster, were outside the club working on the engine of an old black car. Although few in number, the lions were all big boys, bigger than Bugs Meany. But Mr. Patch was bigger than any of them. He had strong hands and big arms, so the lions listened when Encyclopedia spoke. "Do you see this watermelon?" he asked. "Now I take off the handkerchief. There, what do you see?" "The handle," said Buster. "Of a knife," said Corky. "Very interesting," said John. "So what?" said Frank. "The knife," said Encyclopedia, "was used in an attempt to rob Mr. Patch's store." "The knife," said Buster, "doesn't belong," said Corky. "To any," said John. "Of us," said Frank. "Maybe not, but the police will probably take your fingerprints," said Encyclopedia. "If the guilty boy steps forward now, Mr. Patch will ask the police not to be too hard on him." The lions looked serious. Mr. Patch looked serious. The only boy detective in the state looked serious. But that was all. "It's not working the way you planned," said Mr. Patch in a whisper. "None of them has tried to wipe the handle of the knife." Encyclopedia nodded. "Leave the knife in the watermelon just as it is. Don't touch it," he whispered back. To the lions he said, "The police will break up your club if they find one of you is a thief." The lions stopped looking serious. They looked scared. Suddenly John said softly, "Frank owns a knife like that." "A lot of fellows own knives with carved handles," retorted Frank. "Cut it out." "You showed me yours yesterday," John shot back. "You even tried to get me to hold it. Why, my fingerprints might be on that handle." "It's not the same knife," said Frank, "so quit worrying." "I lost my knife last month," Buster said. "Everyone knows I did. Where is your knife, Corky?" "I lost mine too," said Corky. "This one couldn't be my knife anyway. Mine has a blade a half-inch longer." None of the lions remembered what the others' knives really looked like. They began to argue loudly. Each boy tried to put himself in the clear. Too bad," muttered Mr. Patch. "They are scared and fighting among themselves. But none of them has touched the knife to try to get rid of the fingerprints. Your plan didn't work." "Yes, it did," said Encyclopedia. "I know whose knife it is." How did he know whose knife it was?